Welcome to episode 3 of Creative Quilting the K-Way. We're going to look at ripping fabric today. Remember I said I like to do that. It's speedy, it's efficient, and many of the quilts that I make are foundation pieced, so they don't need to be precisely cut before I start. Those little ruffly edges don't matter in the least. So come on, let's get ready and let's rip some fabric. Let's take a look at some of these fabrics that I said we could rip, and let's see how they behave and if they can tolerate ripping. Remember, I'm never going to be ripping if I'm doing some precision piecing where I need to cut things or cut them on the bias, but there are many times when I'm foundation piecing, getting things ready for a back, to piece a back, or lengthwise borders where ripping is going to be the preference. So let's take a look at this piece of silk to start with. So this was an old blouse of mine. I outgrew it, so why not use it in a quilt? I'm going to take a little snip here to rip off this seam allowance, and it's going to work great. I need to take a little bit bigger bite because it wasn't on the straight of grain there, where this, I think it was a sleeve or something. Beautiful. So let's take a look at that edge. Rips just fine, just fine. Let's take a look at some printed fabric. One thing I like to remember when I'm ripping is that if I snip it to start ripping here at a selvage, I have twice as far to rip than if I just go to the fold, take a snip at the fold, then I'm getting better health benefit because I have more resistance when I'm ripping, right? So I'm getting some exercise as well. So I'm going to rip that down. And let's take a look at this printed one. That printed one ripped just fine, just fine. We're going to save this piece for just a second. We're going to revisit it, but that printed fabric ripped beautifully. Let's try another printed fabric. Let's take our little snip at the fold and get ready to rip. Sounds awesome. Love that sound. But now as I look at this piece, I see that there's a problem. So this particular fabric, this gray goods, the way it's printed, when I rip it, I sacrifice a good deal of that edge. Doesn't mean this fabric is not good quality, not in the least. It just means that this is not a piece of fabric that I would rip. I would always cut this one because I'm losing too much of that edge. Okay? You will find that with some fabric, so I always test it before I start getting into ripping a bunch of strips for a project. So this one, no ripping. We saw some of these fabrics in an earlier episode. So we saw this one that is a printed plaid. Let's see what happens when we rip it. So I'm going to snip in here right next to that plaid line. Okay? Take a nice snip right there and let's rip it. Now let's look at that. Oh, are you seeing what I'm seeing? This is a printed plaid. Now, the edge is just fine for ripping, but what we see is that the printing is not straight on the gray goods. You can really see it on this side. So in this instance, if I'm going to be using this plaid and I need to be true to the plaid, I'm going to have to cut it, aren't I? Typically when I use plaids or stripes, I don't care about that, so it's just fine for me to rip it. But if you need to stay in a certain spot on the plaid, you're going to have to cut this printed plaid. Now let's take a look at that woven plaid. Let's take a snip and see how it goes. We're going to snip right along that edge so we can see it. Oh, it rips beautifully straight, right? Because this is a woven plaid. So it's going to stay right, get those strings out of there, right on the same line all the way across. So great for ripping. Let's take a look at what we would do if we wanted lengthwise borders. So crosswise borders would be borders that we cut the fabric, width of the fabric, right? And we pieced it together in strips. Let's say in this particular case, we don't want to do that. We want to have our long borders for our quilt all in one piece, which is a lengthwise border. So let's say my quilt is 60 inches. We already know that the backs of quilts are 4 inches all around, but the front, my borders, can be a true 60.5 or so, right? If I want it to finish at 60. So let's measure out 60 inches of this fabric. There I am at 30, and I want 30 more. And then I'm adding a 1/2 inch. And because I'm ripping this, I'm going to be a little generous. We'll trim it up after it's put on the quilt, but I'm going to snip just a little past 60.5. Now I'm going to rip this section off. So this piece of fabric I have now is about 60 3/4. I want that to be my lengthwise border. My border, let's say, is going to be 8.5 inches. So now I'm going to rip it lengthwise. I'm going to take off both of my selvages, right? So I'm going to take a snip in here and rip off those selvages. Now my border, I want 8.5 inches. So now I'm going to measure. And I can see as I look at this edge that it really didn't destroy it much at all. But I may want to add just about 1/8 of an inch, just for that little bit of destruction there. So if I go 28 3/4 and cut it at 20, I'm ripping 8 3/4. And I can rip 2 of these at once. Remember, more resistance, better exercise. Now I have 2 border strips that I know are exactly the width, the same width and length, just what I want for my finished quilt. Let's snip off some of those strings. And on this one, I'm going to show you another little trick here. Once you rip, the edges can be a little bit furry sometimes. If you just take your iron and you press those, now your edge is nice and straight. And you'd be ready to piece this right on your quilt, right there. So that's how we do lengthwise borders. This is a printed fabric. So let's take a little piece off the end and see how it rips. Not too bad. A little bit crooked on the printing, but this one isn't bad at all. So let's say that this piece now is going to become a quilt back. How am I going to rip to prepare for that? Let's say I have that same 60-inch quilt, right? So now it's 68 inches that I need for my quilt back. So let's measure 68 inches. There's 30, and another 30, and then 8 more inches. Right at the 8-inch mark, and I'm going to rip it. This is 1/2 of my pieced back now. In order to get to 60 inches, if it's a 60 by 60 quilt, I'm going to need another piece this same size. So let's take this, line it up, and get another piece the same size. Snip it right here. Rip right across. If you remember, I said something earlier in an earlier episode about selvages, that we need to rip those off as well. Here we can see the selvages right here. I need to take those off so that I can piece this back together. I'm going to see if I can do all 4 at once. Really get a workout today. So I'm going to line up these 4 edges. Take a snip in so I get past those selvages and rip all the way down. Now these 2 pieces are ready to put right sides together and put the long seam in. Right there. I know that it's nice and square on cross grain and straight of grain because I ripped both of them. Seems to me to be a much easier way to do those big quilt backs than try to cut them straight. Just rip them and they work out just great. We're going to try and rip one more fabric. We're going to try to rip this flannel and see how that works. Just so we know. Flannels a lot of times I use for back, so it would be handy to be able to rip them and know that they're square. Let's take a look at that edge. You know what? It's not too bad at all. If I was ripping for a back, I would rip it. I might add just a little bit because I lost a little bit on the edge there. A couple threads are coming off, but I'll be able to piece that together no problem. So flannel also rips really well. So now we know what rips and what doesn't, and we're going to actually look at a project to get the fabrics ready for that. In the last episode, we talked about these beautiful fabrics here, and that we were going to make a foundation piece quilt with them. So I've got my directions here, and I'm going to look at what my measurements are that I need. It says for my background, I need 7 5-inch strips. Now that's assuming the quilt's going to be this size. Remember I said I'm probably going to make it bigger, so I'm going to need way more than that. But for now, we'll just get some of these strips ripped. We're going to test our first strip, and I can see that I've used this fabric, this bolt of fabric already. I've ripped it already once, and it ripped just fine. So I'm going to make some little snips here to get my 5-inch strips. Now because this is a foundation piece quilt, these edges that they're roughly is not going to matter in the least. We're going to trim them up after we piece the blocks, so it's going to be just fine to have these strips ripped. Don't you love that sound? I absolutely love that sound. So there's a bunch of my black strips. I will need to get more of those later. Next, let's look at what the zinger fabric is. And it says for my zinger, I need 5 2.5-inch strips. Well, if you recall, when we selected these fabrics, we're going to have to use more than one to make enough. So I'm going to go ahead and rip up the little fat quarters that I have here to get them ready. And what I'm going to do first is get a square side so that I know my strip is even. Do you see how I didn't quite make it all the way? I'm going to take a little bit deeper bite so that I start with a straight edge. There. That time it ripped all the way down, so I know that I'll have an even strip. So we need 2.5-inch strips. Let's make some snips. And I will continue to rip all of these fabrics in that way. For my fences, 3.5 inches. So I will get to my fold here. This is the one that I already ripped, and I know that it's straight, so I can make 3.5-inch snip, and then a 3.5-inch snip, and then a 3.5-inch snip, and go ahead and rip those strips. When I have those all done, I'm going to be ready to piece my quilt. Don't be afraid to rip strips. Just test them first and see what happens. It's time for me to tell you the thing that I have learned today. Today I learned that to improve the stitch quality, it works better to plug your sewing machine in before you start sewing. How do I know these things? Thank you so much for joining me for Creative Quilting the K-Way. I look forward to you coming back and seeing you again next time. And remember, you are exactly where you should be.